On the spot with me today for this special Outlook 2014 is a professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins. Professor Steve Hanke joins me on the line. Thanks so much for being with us.
Well, it's wonderful to be with you and be with Kitco in particular, since I follow Kitco for many years.
Today we'll be looking at various topics that we'll need to follow come 2014, including those stress tests that European banks will face. But let's start with a recent article you wrote where you compared bank money versus state money and how these stimulus packages you write are not actually increasing the money supply. What do you make of these policies and how do you expect them to affect the Eurozone come next year?
The situation in Europe is really quite grave in from my perspective, and that is you have to look at the total money supply. And I just said money supply dominates. And if you look at that in Europe, you have a very slow growth in the money supply. It's only growing since the Lehman collapse in the fall of 2008. It's been growing about 1.1% per year in Europe. But people say, how can that be? I mean, the European Central Bank has been pumping out money and the money supply has been growing, but they're looking at what's called state money. And that's the monetary base. That is what the central bank controls, is the monetary base, state money. So state money has been exploding in Europe. Of course, in the United States, it's been exploding too. But what about bank money? We have most of the money, about 90% of the money supply created in Europe is created by banks, commercial banks. And that actually has been declining, and the level of bank money in Europe now is lower than it was at the time Lehman went under in 2008, or Northern Rock collapsed in August of 2007 in the UK. And the stress test will do what? The European regulators will go in, and it'll take about a year to evaluate all the balance sheets at the banks that they're examining, and they're going to come to the conclusion that the banks are capital short and have to increase their capital asset ratios. The capital asset ratios are too low, and that means that they will have to reduce again the loan books that they have and the credit outstanding. So this is just a very dire situation. So Europe is I think going to be tipped into recession, technical recession again. It's right on the verge now.
You just mentioned the stress tests, and the past stress tests we've seen in Europe failed to really show the deficiencies in the system. Do you think that the stress tests we'll see come 2014 will be different?
Well, I think they'll be a lot tougher because there's a lot of political pressure on the regulators to get tough, because supposedly they weren't tough the first time around. But the problem with this is getting tough on banks when you're in the middle of a slump turns into a disaster, and you get into a doom loop because the stress tests say, oh, the banks aren't capitalized enough. And the only way you can increase the capital asset ratio realistically is to reduce the risk assets in the loan book and the credit that the banks have. And that increases the capital asset ratio. But you leave less credit in the economy than you had before, and the economy starts going down the tubes. And when that happens, what happens? You have non-performing loans at the banks go up, and then the banks have to reserve and use up capital that they have a scarcity of just to provision against the non-performing loans that they have. So you're in a true doom loop going down.
So what is the solution for you then?
The solution in this kind of a situation is some forbearance for the banks. You can't continue to beat up on the banks and in effect impose regulations and mandates and requirements that force the banks to deleverage and shrink in the middle of a slump, because you make the slump worse because you're contracting the biggest elephant in the room, which is bank money.
Moving from Europe to China now, are you bullish or bearish on how China's set up?
Again, money dominates. And if you look at China since 2003, the annual rate of growth in the money supply has been 18.45% per year. Very fast rate of growth in the money supply, but of course the demand for money is very high, grows very high and at a rapid rate in China. So if you split the picture in pre-Lehman, 2003 to the end of 2008, the money supply in China was growing at 16.7%, and after Lehman, it's been growing at 18.25%. So China has just kept the money supply right on the trend rate of growth, no deviation. The economy hasn't deviated very much. China hasn't hit the wall, as all the doom and gloom people keep saying China is going to collapse any day. It's not going to collapse any day.
And of course, I need to get your thoughts on gold. How do you see the metal setup?
Now, the gold picture is, we're moving to gold, and that's a little bit of a different category because it's really not a commercial metal per se in the precious metal category, and there is a big speculative component in gold that is different than the speculative component in base metals and commercial goods of all kinds. And this is one where inflation does come into the picture. And inflation is not on the horizon because the money supply in the United States, by the way, is only growing the broad money, Divisia M4 is only growing at 3.7% per annum, very slow rate of growth in the economy. The economy in the U.S. is growing very slowly. The aggregate demand is only growing at about 2.6% per annum, and the trend rate of growth since 1987 in the U.S. economy, nominal terms that is 5%. So we're in a growth recession in the United States. So if people think that hyperinflation is right around the corner because state money is exploding and growing very fast, they're fooling themselves.
So obviously there's a lot of news stories we'll need to follow come 2014. If you had to focus on one and solely pick one, which one would you really be looking at?
I'm focusing on what effect bank regulations will have on the growth of bank money and the growth of credit in the economies. That is the critical question in the U.S. It's even more critical in Europe. It is critical in Japan. And the only one of the big economies that seems to understand what they're doing are the Chinese.
Thanks, Professor, and happy holidays.
Thank you, and same to you.
And thanks for watching this edition of On the Spot. You can email me at newsfeedback@kitco.com or join the conversation on Twitter at Daniela Camboni. Thanks for watching.